Good to see you again. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I remember last year, the last time we spoke, we talked about China's ramped up aggression, strategically, aggressively targeting, especially OT, but now it seems to be none of that's really abated since then. I guess we could start there.
Yeah.
What do you attribute that to?
You know, we've found more intrusions by more China-nexus groups than we've ever seen before. The level of intrusion activity is quite high right now. And there's likely a number of reasons for it, but the core reason for the increased volume of attacks that we're seeing coming out of China, it's just China becoming more prevalent in the world stage. They are continuing to increase geopolitical tensions between the United States and China is getting ready to potentially invade Taiwan. And so as they become a little bit more ready for that, we see them targeting a number of organizations that are of a strategic interest to the PRC, and they're interested to understand what would the world do in anticipation of a potential invasion of Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Plus, they're also very focused and curious about foreign policy matters, trade matters, and other matters that are of interest to the PRC.
But I mean, like, especially Volt Typhoon, Silk Typhoon, getting a lot of headlines about their activities, and a lot of it seems kind of they're preempting for something, apparently.
I hope that they're not, right. But I think a lot of things are pointing towards them strategically gaining position within the United States. I want to be very clear, I haven't yet seen them do anything overtly destructive or disruptive in the United States, but given the level of access that they have, they certainly could do something quite significant, quite damaging. Mm-hmm. And so right now is the time for us to identify the compromises and to do the best that we can to eradicate them from the environments that they're in, and then to continue to defend our critical infrastructure and other organizations across the Western world against adversaries. And it's not just China, it's any adversary that might come in to do something damaging.
Right. So you just wrapped up your talk here at Nexus, and you went into some detail about the activity of some of these groups. Silk Typhoon, we can start there. Don't seem to get the headlines that the other two typhoons do, but you seem particularly concerned about some of their activity.
Oh, yeah.
Can you kind of just from a high level, just describe what they're all about?
Yeah, so Mandiant, we call them UNC 5221. Microsoft calls them Silk Typhoon. Yep. There's a decent amount of overlap, but essentially, this is what we consider to be one of the most prevalent threat actors in the Western world. We see them compromising lots of organizations, technology companies, SaaS organizations, business process outsourcers, law firms, and many more. And we've seen them do things like steal source code from companies. We've seen them leverage access from SaaS organizations to get access to the ultimate environment or the ultimate data that they were interested in. And so the number of victims that are actively dealing with Silk Typhoon is quite high. Now, there hasn't been a lot of media attention on this group because I think there's a lot of focus on some of the other adversaries. Plus, I think a lot of times when companies ended up disclosing security events related to Silk Typhoon, they didn't say Silk Typhoon. They just said they were compromised. Sure. And so we just haven't heard as much about them as, say, maybe Volt Typhoon or Silk Typhoon.
So the targeting of the SaaS companies and the downstream, are those targeted attacks, or are they looking for something at scale? Are they trying to hit someone within the supply chain, for example?
Yeah, they are ultimately targeted. When you think about how the PRC conducts their intrusion operations, they know generally what information they are seeking, and they know generally what organizations have that data, and they know generally what other companies might be part of the supply chain that would enable them to get access to the data that they're ultimately interested in. But what we've noticed about the PRC is they're incredibly patient. They're very strategic in their intrusion operations. And so they could make an assumption that if they compromise technology company X, that makes an enterprise technology that probably multiple targets that they are ultimately interested in use, that would give them some kind of strategic advantage in the long run to get access to the data that they're interested in.
Yeah, there's definitely a long game going on.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So another group you talked about was UNC 3886, and it seems that they're very interested in targeting edge devices. Explain the rationale there. What do you think is happening there in terms of that strategically?
Yeah, so UNC 3886 is one of the most advanced China-nexus espionage groups that we track. They predominantly exploit zero-day vulnerabilities on edge devices, so systems that are exposed to the internet or systems that don't support EDR solutions. They know that the majority of Western companies' detection capabilities is based on EDR detections and EDR alerts. But you can't run EDR solutions on a firewall, on a VPN, on a router, on a VMware hypervisor. And so they've created very sophisticated malware frameworks that exclusively run on specific network devices. They built custom malware frameworks for Fortinet appliances, for Juniper appliances, for VMware infrastructure. And it allows them to maintain access to victim environments for quite a long period of time because they're just really interacting with these network devices that they're compromising. And then if they do need to touch a Windows computer or some other application or system or resource on a company's network, they just use credentials at that point in time. Because they know that if you use malware on a Windows computer, the chances of getting caught are a lot higher than if you're just living exclusively on network devices.
That really stands out, that the purpose-built frameworks for these platforms, from Fortinet, for Juniper, et cetera. There's an indication there's a ton of investment, and obviously that's not a surprise. But any idea what that scale might look like in terms of investment on their end?
Yeah, look, nowadays when you look at the Chinese espionage ecosystem, there's a lot of collaboration amongst groups. There's collaborations amongst the government that's supporting and tasking a variety of groups. So we see a lot of tool usage that's shared amongst multiple threat actors. We see the weaponization of zero-day vulnerabilities and exploit code between multiple threat actors coming out of China. So we know that there's a whole lot more coordination now than, say, back in 2015. So before the Obama-Xi agreement in 2015, where both leaders got together and they said, hey, first of all, we don't acknowledge that anybody's hacking into companies in each other's countries. But in the future, they said that we won't hack into companies in the Western world for the purposes of economic espionage. And what that meant was everything else is fair game. Right. So for military purposes or political purposes, they could continue to hack. But the way the tasking worked was very different. So before 2015, you'd see the PRC would task multiple groups, multiple companies or multiple intelligence units or military units to hack into companies. And as we would investigate these security breaches, we'd find multiple distinct China-nexus threat actors within victim environments, sometimes not even knowing that each other were there. Right. They probably had the same task. Today, that doesn't really happen. We see a single threat actor with a very specific mission for stealing certain data. So for example, when we find that they learn about a new vulnerability in an enterprise VPN appliance, we quite often find them going after a semiconductor company, or maybe a law firm that's dealing on some foreign policy matter, or maybe a technology company that makes some enterprise solution that a whole bunch of other organizations use.
Yeah, the law firm aspect of this too, it's not something that would immediately come to mind, but it makes total sense.
Yeah, I mean, they've got access to a whole lot of very sensitive strategic information that the PRC cares about.
Right. And the targeting of systems that don't support EDR, what's the potential impact on cyber-physical systems there, whether it's OT or healthcare? So.
Yeah, I mean, most cyber-physical systems don't support EDR solutions, so you take what you learn from the incidents that are mostly starting in the IT environment, and you do your best to apply as much of those learnings to the systems within the OT environments. And I think there's a whole lot of commonality, particularly with the threats that we're actively seeing right now. And so you got to do what you can to control access to those OT environments. You want to increase visibility into those OT environments. You want to be able to detect and respond much more quickly to attacks that might bleed over into an OT environment, or perhaps start an OT environment just because somebody brought in a compromised laptop into an OT network, or there's a VPN connection from a vendor that's spread into an OT network for a customer that they're supporting.
Yeah. So with Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, I mean, there's always kind of that, you lean into the fact they've been identified, maybe they've packed up and gone home. That's certainly not the case. What are you seeing in terms of continued activity from them? What do you expect on that front?
Yeah, look, the Chinese government will continue to deny hacking into Western organizations. Right. Just recently, they alleged that the United States hacked into a prominent time organization within China. They published some research about that just this week. They don't want to get caught, So they go out of their way to try to obfuscate who they are. They try to hide as well as they can in environments. And so although we know that it's them a lot of times, there are times where we can't always attribute an attack to a particular country, but sometimes there are things that align with a certain country's objectives or past targeting patterns. And of course, you can't say it's a certain country if you don't have enough concrete data to prove that it is. Again, they don't want to be caught. They don't want to be known. But they're not going to stop because, again, this is part of a long-term strategy for them.
So before we wrap up, I wanted to kind of ask you a couple of questions about just from the incident response perspective. I'm sure you do postmortems with compromised organizations once your investigations are wrapped up. Do you see commonalities among like some of the breakdowns that happen that lead to a breach or even, during incident response?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately,
you don't want to victim shame, I'm sure.
Sure, yeah. Look, and by the way, I fully appreciate how hard it is to defend a network.
Sure.
But as we do these postmortems, we usually find that it wasn't just a single thing that led to the compromise. It's a lot of times, though, to simplify the explanation to people, we'll say something along the lines of the company didn't have multi-factor authentication required for remote access, or they forgot to patch a certain system, or somebody's password was weak. That might have been the initial entry point into an organization. But to get from that entry point to getting enough access to taking sensitive data from the company, or to employ or deploy an encryptor across the enterprise, you've got to have a substantial amount of access to the environment. And in the process of getting that substantial access, the threat actors have to do a number of things that are very loud, they're very noisy. And we usually find that there are dozens or hundreds of security alerts that are generated as a threat actor is going from that initial access to something a little bit more substantial. And so there are, unfortunately, lots of opportunities for companies to identify an attack that's happening in real time and to defend against it.
Sure.
But unfortunately, sometimes companies are just overwhelmed with the number of alerts. Maybe they don't know exactly which things they need to prioritize first. Sometimes the adversary is just moving so quickly that it's hard to stop them. The other thing to note is that sometimes business disruption isn't a direct cause of an action that the threat actor took. It's not always the ransomware that the threat actor deployed. There are a number of times where victim environments are disrupted because the company themselves took an action to try to stop the attacker from gaining more access. So they might have taken down their identity provider, or they may have taken down other systems just to mitigate the risk and the impact of a broader compromise by the actor.
And I mean, some of these ransomware groups, for example, or these extortion actors, they're not exactly quiet on these systems, and there are some warning signs, but alert fatigue's a real thing.
Sure, yeah, the alert fatigue's very real, but the goal of the threat actor, particularly somebody that's going to deploy ransomware and try to extort the company, they want to be loud, they want to be disruptive, they want to identify that they are there, and so they leave ransom notes on thousands of systems. They email victim organizations and say, I'm threat actor X, I want a certain amount of money, you need to pay us. So they're announcing themselves.
So last question. I don't think we talk enough about recovery as an industry. Just from your perspective, what are companies dealing with when it comes to recovery in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of the resources that are involved?
Look, I speak to a lot of boards and a lot of business leaders, and their hope and expectation is that if there was a security event, they'd be able to recover in minutes, or worst case hours. The reality is, when you deal with an enterprise-wide security event, the deployment of ransomware across an enterprise, as an example, the recovery time is usually measured in weeks. Sometimes you get lucky and you're able to recover within days, but usually you're talking about weeks of recovery time. And when you actually get to the point when you recover, you're not actually recovering 100% of your assets and your applications. You're usually getting to 70%, 80%. And it's that last 20 to 30% of recovery that usually takes months. And I have a lot of clients right now that are 1 year into their security event that are still trying to recover some of their business applications and processes. And what we find is that sometimes people just never get to 100%, and they get as close as they can, and then they retire those applications.
Great stuff. Thank you, Charles.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.